For a passage as famous as this one, you might expect we would at least have a consensus on who Jesus was talking to. Today's gospel comes from the Sermon on the Mount, arguably the preeminent discourse of the entire Bible. But Matthew introduced the sermon by telling us, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them. We imagine the sermon being preached at the top of Jesus' lungs to the vast crowds around the mountain. But Matthew's introduction makes it a distinct possibility that Jesus was speaking only to the disciples. Some say that Jesus expanded the sermon to include the crowds at some point along the way. And among those people, deciding when that point is in the text is something of a parlor game. Others say that the Sermon on the Mount wasn't so much a discrete event in Jesus' public ministry, but rather his stump speech, or, God help us, Matthew's idea of Jesus' greatest hits. And those are just some of the most popular ways of thinking about these words in our time. Medieval clergy thought the demands of the sermon were intended to set out a higher standard of behavior for the clergy, especially those in monastic orders. Martin Luther thought the sermon was just as impossible for humans to obey as the Jewish law on which it was based, was thereby meant to humble us and to remind us of our need for God's forgiveness. Still others interpreted the words in an eschatological light, being connected with the end of the world. And of course, still others insisted that they were to be taken literally and applied to everyone in that way. So, all of these tricky categories threaten to confuse us and put us off balance before we even try to unpack the words of the sermon. And more trouble is waiting for us there. Jesus uses metaphors and comparisons that depend heavily on the local culture. He makes sweeping statements about righteousness, and he seems to set a nearly impossible standard for entrance into heaven. Well, let's start there. Jesus has plenty of teachings that are hard to accept, but think again about how he words the last statement in the passage. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. The gospel goes on to portray those people as rather lacking in righteousness, despite their religious offices and their prestigious position in society. So we can read that statement as Jesus saying, if I can forgive jerks like that, you're a shoo-in. Now, if Jesus had said the righteousness of widows and orphans, we should have panicked. So that brings us, working backwards, to another tricky passage about the law. Then, as now, Jews considered the law of Israel to apply only to themselves. But all the disciples were Jewish, and the crowds were generally thought to be so too. So this does raise the question of what the passage means for us. And I think the best answer comes in the language of fulfillment. Jesus said, I have come not to abolish, the law that is, but to fulfill. Christians understand that fulfillment as accomplishing the purposes of the law, particularly restoring a right relationship between God and humanity, and establishing right relationships between human beings and between humanity and nature. As we complete our backward survey of the passage, we come to the language of salt and light. Jesus compares his audience to salt, a precious substance necessary for life that can only give life by immediate physical contact, by effecting change directly in the recipient. Complementing this image, Jesus also compares his audience to light, also necessary for life, but which can cover a great area across a long distance, swiftly, silently, and beautifully. Both salt and light were also used in the rituals of the temple that would have been familiar to the audience. And so Jesus speaks with a deep symbolism that speaks to his mission to create a closer relationship between God and humanity. This relationship is at the heart of the passage. Even if we take Matthew's introduction as narrowly as possible, that is, if we consider the Sermon on the Mount as being addressed only to the disciples, as Christians, we must therefore consider ourselves as part of the audience. We are here in church because we choose to follow Jesus and to follow him in a community of mutual support, just as he established his first circle of disciples to be. Jesus calls us to join him in glorifying God by living lives defined by God's grace and love, by surprising the world with our generosity of spirit, and by revealing the true nature of God to a deeply confused world. The mission Jesus calls us to is one of salt and light, giving life through our concrete deeds and inspiring words. And Jesus goes with us, for the mission is his before ours. So he leads us by word and example, giving us salt and light so that we can make our way on this mission. There is nothing to fear in these gifts of salt and light, for they are given for all. They defeat all categories, cross all boundaries, and lead us home to heaven. The same light of the world is the light of heaven, a beacon and a promise and a gift. Shed as much of this light as you can, and know that you will receive the same abundant light and life as every living thing under the sun. Amen.